What's up, guys? So yesterday I presented a 20-minute presentation on just if we're in the end times based off of the teachings of Matthew 24. And so I decided I was going to upload it as this week's little message thing. But I just wanted to say before I upload that, it was just for an academic reason. The only reason that I want to post it is just to encourage y'all through some thought. I don't necessarily agree. My thesis is that we're not in the end times, and I'm not really sure I agree with that, to be honest. But I did for the presentation just for the sake of a grade. But I say all that to say, take what I said in that video with a grain of salt. Do your own research, go off your own convictions, pray to God, ask him to reveal things to you. But overall, I just wanted to upload it just to encourage y'all, and just so that y'all could see just kind of where I was coming from and breaking down some of the teachings of Jesus in Matthew 24. But like I said, do your own research, see where God leads you through that. And I hope that you pull something out of it. I hope that you're encouraged, and just remember that God could return at any given moment. I try to make it very clear in the presentation, but if you didn't pull that out of the presentation, just remember that Jesus could return at any given moment. Chapter 24, verse 36 of Matthew, it says, the angels won't know, the Son won't know, only the Father knows. We won't know. There's no way for us to know. So just be encouraged. Just take it as, expositional preaching off of Matthew 24 and allow it to encourage y'all. But I love y'all and enjoy this clip.
Oh my gosh, guys, this whole time I thought that we were in the end times, but I found a book, a document that may actually say something else. This whole time I've been prepping and expecting that we were in the end, but this book actually claims something different. So, according to this book, the Bible, there are hundreds of prophecies that are made in the Old Testament that are all fulfilled in the New Testament by one man, Jesus. This book is historically accurate, and it claims to be the perfect, infallible Word of God. So today, we're going to be considering the definition of the end times. We're going to be considering what all of that entails. We're going to look at what's going on in the world today, and we're going to compare it to what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 24. And so, let's look at exactly what the end times are. The end times have four main parts: the resurrection of the dead, the coming Messiah, the judgment, and the end of time as we know it. So this is a graph that shows all of these events in a timeline as described in the Bible. If you notice, there's four main events that are blocked in rectangles. The first one is the rapture of the church. The rapture of the church has two of the first segments of the definition of the end of time, or the end times, excuse me. The rapture of the church has the resurrection of the dead and the coming Messiah. We'll discuss each of these in detail a bit more in a second. This judgment seat of Christ and the final judgment each pertain to the judgment portion of the end of time, or the end times. Eternity, lastly, is the end of time, as mentioned in the definition of end times. But the question is, where do these end times actually begin? So for the sake of understanding, the end times actually begin with the rapture of the church. And anything prior to that is known as the labor pains, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So let's dive into what each of these little sub-points mean. First, the rapture. The rapture literally means to be taken up. As described in 1 Thessalonians, Jesus will come and he will resurrect his church, starting with the dead and finishing with those who are alive. This is, as I said earlier, the resurrection of the dead, which is the church, and the coming Messiah, which is Jesus. The second part, the judgment. As you notice in this slide, there's two main pictures, one on the left, one on the right. As you notice, they're two very different pictures. The one on the left is known as the Bema Seat. The one on the right is known as the Great White Throne of Judgment. The Bema Seat actually originates from the 8th century BC Olympic Games established in Greece. In this seat, in these competitions, these people would compete. They would give everything that they have, and they would run this race with all of the energy and all the athleticism and preparation that they have. When they're done running the race, they would appear before the judge who is seated on this throne. And based on how well they ran the race, this judge would give them an award. Now, the Great White Throne of Judgment, back to the Bema Seat, this is the same for all those who follow Christ. We will run our lives the best that we can, and we will give everything that we have for God. And based on how well we ran our lives, we will get an award in heaven given by God, who is the perfect judge seated on that throne. The second part of judgment is the complete opposite, the Great White Throne of Judgment. This is where all unbelievers will go. And regardless of how well they did in their lives, regardless of how much money they earned or what they did, they will stand before God, and God will say the most terrifying words ever known to man to them. Depart from me, for I never knew you. And he will cast them away from him. The last portion of the definition of the end times is the end of time. So y'all may know this as the battle of Armageddon, the battle between good and bad, the battle between light and darkness. But as described in the Bible, it is the battle between Jesus Christ and Satan. And in this battle, Jesus Christ will defeat Satan and everything that is associated with Satan, the archangels, the beast, the demons, everything. It will cast them into the lake of fire. And Jesus will take all of those who follow him and live with them for eternity in a new heaven and a new earth. And so the question then becomes, what leads to these end times? This is the same question that Jesus' disciples wanted to know. They approached him in Matthew 24 and they asked him this question: when will these things happen, and what will be the signs of your coming and the coming of the end of the age? And this is what Jesus replied first. He says, watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name saying, I am the Messiah, and they will deceive many. Now, the first name that I think of is Enrique Cristo. How many of you guys have heard of Enrique Cristo? Anyone? No? Okay, so notice what Jesus said. He says there will be many false messiahs, and they will deceive many. Enrique Cristo is an example of a false messiah, sure, but clearly he's not deceiving many. He lives in a self-sufficient compound with 12 of his followers. And this is actually a book written about him, The Unexpected Messiah. You can buy it on Amazon. But he is not deceiving many, as shown here. And not to mention, if you look to find other false messiahs, other people that claim to be Jesus, you'll be stretched to find more than 7 or 8 of these false messiahs, because there's not many of them. This is an example of something that Jesus said that is not yet in motion to the extent at which he said. The second thing that he said is that there will be wars and rumors of wars, kingdom against kingdom and nation against nation. Now, it doesn't take more than 2 trips looking at the news on CNBC or something to see that there are wars and rumors of wars everywhere. If you look up War World on New York Times, you're met with over 500,060 responses. You're met with over 500,000 responses. And that's a lot. If you consider the countries that are currently at war, we know places like Ukraine and Russia, Israel, Gaza, and Palestine are all in wars currently. We know countries like America, Iran, and China are all listed in rumored wars. And so by considering each of the people that are considered in rumored wars and wars, we know that this is an example of something that Jesus said that is not yet, or that is in motion to the extent at which he said. The next thing that Jesus said is he said there will be famines, which is also translated epidemics, and earthquakes in various places. It doesn't take, or I think we all know that there was an epidemic recently, the coronavirus. But Jesus said there would be epidemics. The people who translated the Bible were extremely specific and particular about how they translated the Bible. If it was plural, they would translate it plural. If it was singular, they would translate it singular. So this word epidemics is translated plural, but we only know of one. Now let's look at famines. If you notice this map right here, we can see that there are, sure, plenty of famines, but we can see that they're really only in 2 main spots. Jesus said they would be in various places. But if you look at earthquakes, on the other hand, you can tell that in this image there's 38 earthquakes listed, and they're in various places. So this is an example of something that Jesus said that is a little bit in motion, but not quite to the extent at which he said, because of the lack of various places that they're in and the lack of other epidemics. The next thing that Jesus said is that they will hand you over to be persecuted and they will kill you. You will be hated by all nations because of my name. These are some statistics and a map that show Christian persecution. If you notice the map, there's a ton of countries that are persecuting Christians, sure, but it's not every nation. It's not all nations like Jesus said they would be. The statistics on the top prove this. 1 in 7 Christians persecuted worldwide, 2 in 5 in Asia, 1 in 5 in Africa. We can see that there's Christian persecution. That's not the question, though. The question is, are Christians being persecuted in all nations? And we know that they're not, based off of this chart in this graph. And so again, this is an example of something that Jesus said that is not yet in motion to the extent at which he said. The next thing that Jesus said comes out of verse 10. There's actually 3 different portions to this prophetic verse. He says, many will fall away. When I think of people falling away, I think of people leaving the church. And so this is a graph that shows church membership per generation and just in its entirety. As you may notice, it is on the decline. And for the first time in American history, church membership is actually a minority. But we have to consider, does church membership actually define salvation? If you go to church, does that mean that you're saved? Or if you don't go to church, does that mean that you're not saved? Not necessarily. And also, look at this graph. If you notice, this is a graph that stretches over 80 years. 80 years of people leaving the church. That's not many in a short period of time like Jesus said they would be. He said there would be many who leave their faith, that fall away. And there was not many recently. This has been a gradual process. The next thing that Jesus says in verse 10 is that many will betray one another. Again, when I think of betrayal, I think back to the church. And so this is a chart that shows the different denominational branches in churches. It doesn't take, if you just drive to my house from school, you'll pass around 7 different denomination churches. This graph shows 6 main denomination churches. And I honestly think this is a little sugar-coated. I think this image shows more accurately each of the denominations. There's dozens of them. But if you notice, after the year 2000, there hasn't been much betrayal, if you will, of church denominations. There hasn't been many branches since the year 2000. And so this is an example of something that Jesus said that has come to fruition a little bit, but not quite at the level at which he said it would. The next thing and the last thing that Jesus said in verse 10 is that many will hate one another. We know that hate crimes are very high in the United States in the last few years, but it's important that we look at the big picture, the last few decades in America. I think this line best shows more accurately the hate crimes in America. If you notice, this is actually trending downwards. Jesus said that many would hate one another, but this shows that actually many less are hating each other as the years go on. The next thing that Jesus says is that many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. So when I say the word prophet, a lot of us think they're going to say that the end of the world is here, right? Like we think of prophet, we think of Isaiah and Jeremiah in the Old Testament, people saying the end of the world is here. But the word prophet literally means to have a word from God. And that brings me to 2 main names, Joel Osteen and Benny Hinn. These 2 men have very different teaching styles. Joel Osteen claims that God will do these things, or God should do these things, or because you prayed for it, God is going to make these things happen, but that's just not biblically accurate. God is not confined to human desires. Benny Hinn, on the other hand, claims to have direct words from the Lord. He claims different things that the Lord told him that are simply inaccurate. So although both of these men have different teaching styles, they are considered both false prophets because they both have false words from the Lord. Let's take a look at one of Benny Hinn's teachings that is inaccurate and false prophecy.
Let's go to Matthew 24. I'm going to show you something incredible, as they say in Spanish, incredible. Is that the way you say it? Incredible, whatever. Okay. Matthew 24, they asked the Lord a question. They said, what will be the sign? They didn't say signs, plural. They said, what will be the sign, singular, of your coming? And so the Lord begins by giving him something most remarkable. Jesus gave him the sign in verse 32, but signs, as he begins in verse 4, he said there will be deception. Well, there's been deception ever since the Lord himself walked the planet. So there's nothing new about deception. And they will say, I'm Christ. Well, it's been going on a long time. Verse 6, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Yeah, it's been happening a long time, over 2,000 years, in fact. Verse 7, nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. It's been happening a long time. There's nothing new about that. There'll be pestilence, there'll be earthquakes in diverse places. And he said, now this is the beginning of birth pains. The Greek says birth pains. So all the earthquakes and the pestilence, which now we see with the coronavirus, it's just the beginning of the trouble. I'll give you a little piece of news that I felt in my soul yesterday. Someone will come up for a cure for that coronavirus. Guaranteed. I know it by the Holy Ghost, so relax. Okay? Just calm down. It'll probably kill about 5,000 people. That's what I felt from the Lord. It's gonna timber down. It'll be all done. But frankly, thousands will die. When it hits 5,000, it'll change. It'll shift. There'll be a breakthrough after that.
Now, if you notice anything about this teaching from Benny Hinn, you notice 2 main errors. First, he's looking at the same passage that we're looking at today, but he comes at it with a very shallow approach. He has no research and nothing to back up that what he says is true. The second thing that he does is he claims that only 5,000 people are going to die from the coronavirus. We all know that's not true because of the news statements that we have seen of the many more that have died from the coronavirus. So this is an example of false prophecy because he claims these things that are not true. Let's take a look at Joel Osteen and examine one of his false prophecies.
I want to talk to you today about the promise is coming. We're all waiting for something. waiting for a dream to come to pass, or waiting for a health to improve, waiting for a child to turn around. When it's taken a long time and we don't see anything happening, it's easy to get discouraged and think that it's not meant to be. But the scripture says in Hebrews 10, patient endurance is what you need now. Then you will receive all that God has promised. This is saying, don't get talked out of what God put in your heart. Just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it's not going to happen. God is faithful. He heard your request. He sees you standing in faith. He hears you thanking him when you could be complaining. What you're believing for is on the way. When you prayed in faith, according to God's will, he put the promise on the schedule. He already set the time to bring it to pass. You may not see any sign of it. Nothing looks like it's changing, but God is working behind the scenes. Things are happening right now that you can't see. He's lining up the right people, arranging the good breaks, the healing, the freedom, the abundance. It's just a matter of time before you see what God is up to. But here's the key. Before the promise is fulfilled, you have to pass the discouragement test.
In this teaching by Joel Osteen, we observe three main things that are inaccurate with his teaching. The first is he claims scripture out of context. The Hebrews 10 passage was not talking about faith, but rather about sin. The second thing that he does is he claims when we believe in faith, it is already in motion. Although that's not exactly biblical. It has to be according to the will of God and God's timing and God's plan, not our desire. And the last thing that he does is he claims that we have to pass some form of a discouragement test. While Jesus does say that you have to have faith in him, he never says anything about being discouraged. And so both of these men are examples of false prophets, and as you can tell by the size of their congregations, they are deceiving many. But the question is, are there many false prophets that are deceiving many? Or is it just a few like these men? The next thing that Jesus says is that because lawlessness will multiply, the love of many will grow cold. This is a chart showing the acts of lawlessness in America. A lot of us like to think of this one on the right here more often. We think of this recent incline of like 19% and 6% from the year prior. But I think it's important that we once again look at the big scheme, the big picture of what all has been going on in terms of acts of lawlessness in America. We notice in the graph to the left that there have been percentage drops such as 15% from the years prior. And so it's important for us to realize that while it may look like lawlessness is growing recently, it is actually on the decline in American history, just like acts of hate. The last thing that Jesus says comes out of verse 14. He says, the good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed in all the world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. This is a graph showing the number of people that have been reached with the gospel versus the people who have not. The people in blue are the people reached, and the people in orange are unreached. Now, your question may be, what does it mean to be reached or unreached? To be an unreached people group, that means that you have never heard the gospel. You've never heard the name of Jesus. To be reached means you have heard and have been reached with the gospel. So, by showing this graph, we can see that what Jesus said is not at fulfillment in the level in which he said. He said that all people groups will hear the gospel. The numbers behind this is about 10,000 people who have heard the gospel compared to 7,400 that have not. This is an example of something that Jesus said that is far from fruition, is far from the level at which he said. And not to mention, this is the most impactful prophecy because Jesus says this must happen and then the end will come. And based off of this graph, the end will not come soon. But let's look at a broad scale of everything that we've talked about so far. We've seen that there are wars and rumors of wars, that it doesn't take more than 2 trips onto the news to see this, that there are hundreds of thousands of rumors and wars that we can read about on a daily basis. We've seen that there's earthquakes and famines, but there's not famines in various places, and also the other translation, epidemics. There's really only been one recently. We've seen that people have left the church, sure, but does church membership define salvation? We've seen that there's been betrayal in terms of church denomination, but there hasn't been much recently. We've seen that there's been false prophets that deceive many, but are there many false prophets? We've seen that there's not many that are claiming to be the Messiah, nor are they deceiving many. We've seen that there's Christian persecution, sure, but not in all the world like Jesus said it would be. We've seen that there's hate and lawlessness, and while it may be increasing over the last few years, over the span of decades, it is decreasing in America. And lastly, we've seen that the gospel is very distant from being proclaimed in all nations. And as much as I want to stand up here and confidently tell you that Jesus is not going to return here soon, I would be doing y'all a disservice if I didn't tell you the full picture. Jesus also said this, we won't know. And this statement is much more loaded than we originally think. This statement actually originates and has much more context when you step back into the Eastern culture in which Jesus lived in. In this culture, a man, to find a woman and to marry a woman, he would have to go and find her. And to marry her or propose to her, he would have to give gifts to the father. When the father finally agreed to let him marry his daughter, the son would then return home and he would build onto his father's house. He would add an extra room. And when he was done building that room, he would go back and get his bride. But the bride never knew when he was returning. There was no text message, there was no email, there was no carrier pigeon. She wouldn't know. And the same is true for us. Christ paid the price for us to our Father. He paid the blood. And he went back to our Father's house to prepare an extra room for us. And he will return at an hour that we don't know. A commentary on this says that we won't know, we can't know, the angels won't know, even Jesus doesn't know, but only God knows when Jesus will return. And an example of this to prove this is the Mayan calendar. The Mayan calendar works in 5,000-year great cycles, as they were called. And the end of this first cycle ended in 2012. And so in 2012, many people believed the end of the world was here. They believed the world was going to end, as did I. I believed the world was going to end, but based off of this teaching and reading that all of these prophecies are actually not being fulfilled, we know that because we believe that it may be one way or another, it's not necessarily so. Even though people believed the world was going to end in 2012, it didn't happen, clearly. And the same is true if we believe that the world's not going to end, it may still end. It's all about God's will and God's timing and when he wants this to happen. But when considering just the teachings of Jesus in Matthew 24, we can conclude that Jesus is not going to return soon. We are not in the end times. Even though I had previously thought this whole time that we were in the end times, we can tell that Jesus is not going to return by simply considering what Jesus said in Matthew 24. Thank you.
Any questions?
Dylan?
You said that you used to believe that we were in the end times. What made you start looking into the possibility that we're actually not?
So I think for most things in life, I'm one of those guys that really likes to just kind of establish my own belief. But honestly, I think it's most important that we come back to the Word of God. And as I said at the beginning, this book has proven true in every situation. So I think it's important that we return to the author and the creator to see when he desires for the end of time to be. So that's just kind of what changed my perspective on it. Knox?
I have a question about Joel Osteen.
Go ahead.
So, do you think he truly believes, in the Bible, he's truly a Christian, or do you think it's all just a money grab?
I believe that he believes in bits and pieces of the Bible. I think he believes in the parts that encourage him and encourage those around him, but maybe not as much of the sin aspect and the fact that we are in a fallen creation. Adrian?
What are the acts of lawlessness that you're talking about, and how did you measure those for this presentation?
Yeah, so it was a website, and the acts of lawlessness were actually murder and homicide rates in America. So let's get to them.
You stated that those two were false prophets, correct? According to whom?
So the definition of
Obviously, they have million, or I don't know how many followers.
they do, yes ma'am. Yeah, so just according to the definition of prophet and claiming a word from God, both of these men do that through their teaching. They
So,
claim that.
according to you?
Well, yes ma'am, according to the
Okay,
definition.
just wanted to make sure about that. And one other question, the rapture. It's very interesting in the source material you had. Do all Christian ministers believe that the rapture is going to be a literal event?
No ma'am. That's one of the biggest divides in the study of Revelation, is that many pastors believe that some of this is more figurative. Some pastors believe that the whole book of Revelation is more figurative compared to some pastors that believe it's all to be taken literally.
Time is up. Is all through?